Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 7th of July. Today we're looking at important updates from the Pokrovsk, Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, and Luhansk fronts. And on the Luhansk front, we're going to look at Makiivka, which I discussed in several videos this week already. And then I haven't covered yet, but I really should have looked into the situation around the village of Pischane. And so we're going to do a detailed review of that part of the front line and a recent Russian advance to that area, which I think will be interesting. But we're going to begin once again by looking at the Vovcha river fronts, where we do have once again Russian advances, this time specifically in the region to the southwest of Oskil. Essentially, what's happening is the Russian forces, they found this gap in the Ukrainian line, which is in between these two fortified positions that are just in the general chain of villages extending out of the Vovcha river tributary here. So you have Oskil, you have Avdiivka here along this particular line. And then you have Novomykhailiva Pischane further south. And so then there's this large area in between this sort of hinterlands region where you do have one fortified structure, although it doesn't appear that the Ukrainians have control in that region anymore. It is just too exposed to Russian artillery fire and airstrikes, whatever it may be. And at this point, it just turned into a part of the gray zone. And so that one structure in the region has been neutered. And so now the Russian forces have this freedom to roam through the entirety of these fields, whether it be on foot or through vehicles. And they were able to advance all the way to the Vovcha River, all the way to the river line, and are now, if you measure with a measuring stick, just about 1.3 kilometers away from the nearby Ukrainian defense line that was set up in the region for the post-Vovcha situation and dynamics. And so you first of all have this Russian sort of forward force reaching very close to the next Ukrainian line. But the other significant part of this advance, which if we measure it at this point, it's an advance of about 600 meters from the front line that we had marked yesterday, is the fact that now the Russians have a very strong northern flank to attack the entirety of Novomykhailiva Pischane, not just along this particular road here that is going like vertically north and south, but also in order to cut off one of the crossings past the Vovcha River, which is located over here. You could see it. It's only a couple of hundred meters away from the current Russian zone of control. They've already been able to reach one of the crossings, which is, of course, just this road crossing near one of the wider parts of the river in this direction. And so now the Russian forces will have that access to this point to cross over the river. And that will give them, of course, the opportunity to take out these various Ukrainian strongholds that were set up and simply didn't have enough time to connect them together, which will be one of the issues that the Ukrainians face going forward. The fact that they haven't had enough time to connect all these strong points together. But what the Ukrainians did try to do is set up the strong points strategically in areas where they knew the Russians would try to cross over because there were roads over there. And so now just a matter of the Russians trying to attack them head on, but also trying to flank them, as we're going to get into in a second. But there are a few other crossings past the river in this region. You just, first of all, could cross over at any given point in this rather narrow area along some of the unpaved paths over here. And it wouldn't be particularly difficult because the river here is more akin to a stream. It is just so narrow. And so for troops on foot, it is extremely easy. And then for that reason, the Ukrainians set up a strong point over here, but it is, again, not connected to the nearby areas. And then you have the village of Makiivka, and just to the south, there is actually this physical crossing along the paved road. And so that's another area where the Ukrainians made sure to set up certain defenses. And then as you go further south and you reach some of the wider parts of the river, at that point, it's more difficult to cross through there. And you have, of course, the actual reservoir crossing located over here, which the Ukrainians are still utilizing to move forces back and forth from the zaporizhia salient, as I now refer to it. We're going further north. I always talk about this, and I'm going to continue talking about it because it is important on a local level. But the Russian push along the rail line has opened up the opportunity for progress to be captured rather quickly, as it's on that same vector of advance. And that poses a big danger to the Ukrainian forces that still remain within this pocket east of the river, but also to the ones that are defending on the new line of defense west of Vovcha, for instance, in this area over here. Because what you have is essentially this large rail embankment that dominates the entire Pokrovsk axis, essentially, and it runs along the rail line, also into the Ukrainian positions that are going further southwest. And so you have this just massive height that also in part Ukrainians still control. and then it sort of extends outwards from there into the fields just west of the Vovcha River, which you see I'm marking right here in this sort of red shape. And to the south of that, you have this tributary extending, or not really tributary, but it is this sort of like valley that sort of protrudes from the rail line, and that's where you do have some of the Ukrainian villages in this region. And they are all protected by this particular X marking that I have over here, where you have a lot of the defenses set up. And in theory, the Russian force in advance axis is occurring along this rail line sort of vector, which is flanking the Ukrainian positions within that X mark from the north. And so that will have, of course, implications for any sort of Ukrainian hopes of trying to stall the Russian advance at the Vovcha River. And even regardless of what happens on the northern flank, there will definitely still be direct Russian attacks. So you could see a variety of Russian firepower being utilized, whether it be FABs being utilized on certain large strongholds or just an increase in artillery outputs as the Russian forces arrive closer to these open trenches or trenches that are located in tree lines. Really, they will become targets. Looking at the New York Toretsk area, first of all, we have information about other Russian units that may be involved because we had this compilation released a day or two ago from the Russian side showing some of the destruction that they caused to the Ukrainian side as they were moving in their own tanks and trying to set up these makeshift defenses within the Toretsk suburbs. And so that was actually on July 4th. I just never reported on it. But the unit that was involved in these FPV strikes targeting Ukrainian tanks and destroying one of them is the Ghost Group. And Ghost Group, there's also a similar unit that may be the same one. It's called the Prizrak Ghost Battalion. It's a unit with a lot of experience within the Luhansk 2nd Army Corps. And they had a lot of fighting in the Bakhkmut area up until about like 6-7 months ago when we just stopped hearing from them. And so it's possible that now they've been moved to the sector after a long period of just radio silence, and they could be involved in these attacks. You also have on the Ukrainian side the movement of another unit to seal the line over here. And this time their role is to directly respond to the Russian advance that is occurring within the suburbs of Zaporizhia and then further north, Pivnishnya. That's basically one of the deadliest, I think it is actually the deadliest part of the fighting right now, because it's going on in the most urban sort of field, most urban arena in this region. And so let's zoom in and actually see what they did. So the 32nd Brigade, they released a video today confirming their presence just east of Toretsk. And we could see that marked over here. They actually sent in a tank to shell the Russian forces that are still holed up within the apartment complex that we've been talking about now for 3-4 days. And so there definitely is a Ukrainian attempt. They're moving in whatever new reinforcements they have to try to hold the line here because they want to prevent the Russian forces from utilizing this apartment complex in a manner in which they would be able to dominate the surrounding residential buildings and also undermine the Ukrainian line of defense, which is just a couple hundred meters to the west here. You could see it marked in yellow. This is the Ukrainian line of defense, which is connected and sort of is organized by these two nexes, the nexus over here to the north and to the south, these massive slag heaps, which give the Ukrainians vantage points. But then the apartment complex also gave the Russians a massive local height advantage. And so they have sent in these tanks and also soldiers to try to fight and repel the Russian ground assault. So far, this is only proof that the Russians have been able to further expand control because the tank was firing into apartments that previously we thought were in the gray zone. But if they're firing to those regions, the implication is the Russian forces were able to reach those particular areas. And so the Russians expanded from these first two apartments to reach the rest of the southern parts of the complex. And so there's heavy fighting going on here. At the very least, Ukraine would hope to destroy these apartment buildings in the same way the Canal District was severely damaged, in the hopes of trying to diminish the amount of apartments that could be used to Russia's advantage. But this is important because now we're seeing the diversion of Ukrainian forces away from other parts of the front line where they were involved in, because all these units did have an active presence in other parts of the front line. It's not like they were sitting around in the reserve pool. And so now we're seeing a lot of them moved into here in very quick succession, which does open up opportunities for Russian forces on other parts of the front line, as we're going to get into in a second. But when you're looking at it, you have 1, 2, 3, then 4 brigades moved here just very recently in the past week or two. That's 8,000 men approximately if all of the forces were moved in. and then also a battalion. So it could amount to about 9,000 troops that were moved into this region at a rather fast pace in order to prevent any sort of faltering of the line here. And that does have broader implications. And one area where troops were moved away from, as I talked about, was the 28th Brigade from Chasiv Yar. And that's what we're going to get into right now. So Ukrainian sources mentioned the Russian DRGs operating within new parts of the forested regions just east of the canal. One area where they showed this was just to the southeast of Chasiv Yar, and they showed a 500-meter advance, but that was previously marked as under Russian control on my map, so it's not anything new to my knowledge. They also showed an advance of up to 1 kilometer of the Russian forces in this particular region over here, and based on footage released by the 23rd Mechanized Brigade, there's actually proof of Russian forward elements operating right next to the canal. And so I have a general marker showing the broad location of the Russian soldiers. This is a part of the 23rd Brigade's compilation, a unit that was previously stationed on the northern flank, you could say, of Charatina, and it did have a lot of importance in that region a couple of months ago. And for a while now, I've been wondering about where their location was because we didn't receive enough information about their frontline endeavors. And so there was probably a period in which they were rotated out or had a diminished presence, and now they've been moved to the Chasiv Yar region to serve as reinforcements, especially in this region just around Kalina, which is an area where they are absolutely needed in order to maintain a Ukrainian presence east of the canal itself, because the fall of Kalina would mean the fall essentially of all of the Ukrainian bridgehead that is directly east of the city of Chasiv Yar. You do have some other villages that are east of the canal further north, but that has less to do with the direct engagements within the city of Chasiv Yar. And so what we see with the 23rd Brigade is just this large scale compilation, like 5 minutes of just continued FPV shelling, actual artillery shelling towards Russian dugouts. And those dugouts are scattered throughout regions within this forested area, in the Kalina area, and also rather close to the canal. So some of them could be Ukrainian dugouts, so the Russians occupied. And the way that we know that these videos were even filmed here is because we saw the Ukrainians targeting Russian forward DRG crews in and near the regions of this pipeline here, which I can zoom in on. And there are 3 overhead pipelines in this very small strip of land, which is just east of the canal and east of this forested region, which is also north of most of Chasiv Yar. It's a strip that I guess spans 700 meters, and it's an area where you've had the most Russian DRG activity because it is just easiest. You're coming in from a very concealed forested region that is hard for Ukrainian drone crews to see, and there are a lot of Ukrainian drone crews in this region. And they were able to make it all the way to these pipelines, and in some cases they were able to advance from the northern to the southern tip using the pipeline itself. And so individual soldiers would like hop in through openings and just go through. And sometimes the Ukrainians spotted them, like in this video, and tried targeting them. There's also several small structures that are adjacent to the pipelines, whether it be here or in basically the edges of the strip of land, in the pumping stations, for instance, where you also have Russian soldiers seeking refuge in certain cases. And that's also a way in which we know that they're operating in these regions. The concern for the Ukrainians is that the Russian forces here have not been repelled, and the longer they're here, the more they're, first of all, aware of the entire minutia of the geography and of the battlefield, and then they become more comfortable operating in this area and continue solidifying control elsewhere, like in Kalina, and it's going to be harder over time to push them back. And having this large Russian activity here right next to your line of defense, which is built right next to the canal, it is dangerous, and it does undermine those defenses going into the future in the coming months, especially looking at some of these nearby extensions of Kalina, which have already been undermined in previous Russian assaults. Continued DRG activity here leads to infiltrations into these lines, and over time, it will become harder and harder for Ukraine to repel them. Now, looking at Makiivka, you have the 2 Russian regiments that have been operating here, the 254th and 488th Motor Rifle Regiments of the 144th Motor Rifle Division, pushing towards Makiivka along this paved road. This is their main axis of advance. At the same time, it's accompanied by these pincers from the north and south as they try to find infiltration points into this rather small village, although it is still an important village. And you could see that the Russian forces along the central axis, they were able to advance around 700 meters from the previous line of contact. As I said in the last video, it's all a part of trying to find a crossing past the Zherabets River. And this is an area where there definitely is a crossing. This one was actually destroyed, but could be restored with pontoons. And then you have one that wasn't destroyed, to my knowledge, in this region over here. And then there may be another crossing just over here in this region. And so there are several ways to get past the river in this relatively narrow area. And that just poses a lot of threats to the Ukrainian garrison that is operating around Nevska. But then also further south, you have this Ukrainian effort that has been successful in pushing back the Russian forces several hundred meters east from the actual Zherabets River. And that's the means by which they've been able to protect their bridgehead here. And so now the Russian forces, unable to push directly towards Makiivka and Terny, they may have seen this option around Makiivka with a gap here and are trying to just flank the entirety of the bridgehead from the north. That could be the longer term idea behind it. And as I said before, you have Azov generally operating in this region to try to fill any sort of gaps. And another thing to note is that as we go northwards, the 32nd Mechanized Brigade, they had a pivotal role in maintaining control of the area around Novomykhailiva. And now they've been moved away to defend in the Toretsk area, as I made clear beforehand. And so that may be a part of why the Russians are pushing here. It could also be a part of a broader Russian activation in this region, which started last month with further pushes into Tabaivka and then the actual capture of Berestove, which I should be marking in red, not black. And it's manifested itself in videos that were released today and yesterday and reports that just recently came in about Russian advances here. And so previously we had a front line that I guess you could say looked something like this, where Krokhmalne was sort of the front line village and then Berestove was sort of protruding as a sort of salient here. And now the Russian forces have been able to take advantage of several things. First off, their control of a very important local height that runs along the rail line over here that I'm marking in green. This green marked rail line embankment, it has a height that is basically situated on it and then spans out both east and west. And so you do have an important Russian height in the region overlooking the battlefield. And does overlook Ukrainian positions, whether it be in Makiivka, Pischane, Berestove at the time, and help them capture those nearby regions. And then also the fact that the Russians had control of Berestove allowed them to attack towards Pischane, both from the southeastern direction, but then also from the sort of northeastern direction from the various ditches and open fields of Tabaivka. And so we saw that occur actually with a video from July 6th. And it's a video from the 205th Battalion of the 241st Territorial Defense Brigade, where they claim to have repelled a Russian mechanized assault east of Pischane. In the video, you can see initially like 6 vehicles that are advancing in a column formation and attacking towards Pischane and generally around these ditches here. And then you see a shot of 4 of them getting abandoned, and then at the end, some sort of Ukrainian fire towards them to ensure they get destroyed. But then that raises the question about the other vehicles, what ended up happening to them if they're able to actually get closer and dismount soldiers in nearby tree lines that are just very close to the village. And then we also have information from Ukrainian sources like Deep State and Petrenko, where they also verify that there was a Russian advance, which is now permanent. So they marked it in red, and it amounts to something in the ballpark of 4.5 kilometers to the southwest, with the deepest Russian advance actually reaching within the southern parts of Pischane, which is divided by the Pischane River here. And the capture of this village would be very important for the Russian forces, and I see why they went for it. Because first of all, you had the lower troop density, which is sort of trying to be filled in by this battalion here that we talked about from the TDF. But then you look at what Pischane gives you, it unlocks 2 particular hills. First, we'll begin with this area here, this X south of Berestove. This is an area that has been near the front line for a long time. It's the operating node for the Ukrainian forces that fought in Novomykhailiva and lost that area and are now garrisoned in Makiivka. And it's just a massive height that sort of gives the Ukrainians a bit of parity in relation to the Russian heights that is also nearby along the rail line. And so that's the first region. and it of course overlooks the rest of these chains of villages that are near the Oskil river itself, and so that's important. And then going further north, it also unlocks this other very important height, which also overlooks the Oskil line, but is also even closer to certain areas along the P20 highway, I think it's called here, and towards regions like Petropavlivka and the eastern suburbs of Kupyansk. And so this would be very important for the Russians because it's an area that is on a hill, so tactically it is significant. But then there aren't any sort of large fortified structures here or villages that the Ukrainians can resist in. And so that would give the Russians an option to advance here at a faster pace than in an area where there are actual villages involved, and decrease the depth of the Ukrainian defenses towards the city of Kupyansk, which is, of course, one of the important goals in this sector. And so that's all that for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.